Hey guys, it's Lady, and today I want to talk about one of the most moving things in the world to me, and that's the human capacity to change, and how even the most flawed individuals can become better people in the end. By the way, I'm still working on that 10,000 subs special video, so here's a quicker one that's not quite as in-depth as my formal analyses slash video essays. But anyway, first I want to throw out a couple disclaimers. For one, I'll be focusing on the kind of change where someone is clearly an asshole at the start, but eventually owns up to their mistakes and learns to treat others better. So in other words, I'm focusing on characters that tend to have rough interactions with other people. You know, the characters who come off as very abrasive and or even arrogant at times. And so since I'm primarily a Trails and Persona YouTuber, I want to talk about my favorite examples of this that exist in these games. Which brings me to my other disclaimer. I will be bringing up spoilers for Persona 3, including the answer, and while they may not be main plot spoilers, I will be talking about things from Cold Steel 1 all the way to Cold Steel 4 as they pertain to Machias' character growth. So this video is just gonna be me gushing about why this is one of my favorite character archetypes, with 3 characters in particular that I want to talk about, those being Junpei, Yukari, and Machias. So Junpei, along with Yukari, is one of the most obviously flawed characters in Persona 3, and by flawed I mean as a person, not that his character writing is flawed. He's prone to jealousy and lashing out at the protagonist early on, and he basically blames him for being just better than him. Like, what, Junpei? Clearly he has some kind of inferiority complex and has such a huge desire to prove otherwise that he nearly sabotages the entire team's mission. And so with that said, I think one of the most relatable feelings ever is that knee-jerk reaction to people who slight us, whether we capitalize on getting back at them or not. So it's no wonder to me that a lot of people were turned off by this character early on. I personally am one to turn the other cheek now, since I recognize that I'm guilty of lashing out in anger and frustration before. Maybe not as bad as Junpei ever, but I think all of us self-respecting individuals can say we've angrily responded to someone at some point in our lives. But anyway, learning not to clap back when other people wrong us takes mindfulness. And so, in a similar light, it can take a lot of mindfulness and practice to refrain from lashing out in the first place. For some, more so than others, like people who are easily prone to anger. Someone like Yukari, for example. She clearly feels emotions very strongly and has a tendency to speak before she thinks. When she's angry and frustrated, mostly at herself and her circumstances, she takes that out on the protagonist, Mitsuru, and later in the answer, I guess. But as my friend Bubble Tea addressed in his great video about Yukari, many people just write her off as a bitch and want nothing to do with her afterwards. Look, it's fine not to like her, but I won't take the slander that she's a terrible person when the vast majority of the time she's trying to become better. That's a far cry from being an actually narcissistic bitch who refuses to see how they're wrong and thinks the world revolves around them. So with that said, one of the biggest things I respect is when a person can admit when they are wrong, especially if they apologize and make up for it. And by that, I mean like real, genuine apologies and or genuine attempts to make up for the wrongs they've committed towards others. Even if it takes a long time, the fact that some apologies come later tells me one of 2 things, if not both at the same time. And that's 1, this has actually been bugging them for a long time already, or 2, they have enough of an awareness of others to realize that they've made a mistake once it's made known to them. Legit, there are tons of people out there who refuse to swallow their pride, even when it turns out they are in the wrong. Yukari actually has a ton of self-awareness on the other hand, and even acknowledges in-game that she's prone to saying terrible things when she's hurting. But she apologizes to the protagonist. She apologizes for the assumptions she's made about Mitsuru and ends up becoming one of her best friends. Something that the latter actually cherishes, because otherwise she doesn't normally reach out to others on an actual friendship-making level. And even in the answer, I actually love how Yukari was an example of how many people deal with grief. You know, with anger and taking it out on their loved ones. It definitely doesn't make it right or justifies that kind of behavior, but Yukari admits that she was wrong about everything. And she realizes that she backtracked for a while there because of her insufficient coping mechanisms, and ends up making it up to Aigis by inviting her to be her roommate in the end. And hey, this is just a quick add-in, but I also want to briefly talk about Alisa from Cold Steel as well. So she's honestly very similar to Yukari in that she does make outbursts she ends up regretting, at least early on. But even though she unfortunately started off with the very tropey tsundere slap at first, it was such a breath of fresh air that she apologized so early, right by the start of the field day in the very first chapter. I also can't help but notice that her personal troubles are very similar to Yukari's as well. You know, with trying to balance a difficult relationship with her mom since the passing of her father. She even has a similar kind of moment in her CS4 bonding event that Yukari has in the answer. You know, where she makes a sudden decision that's actually rather hurtful, albeit it was at least in a respectful manner. In a way, I chalk that up to Alisa having a longer time frame to grow and mature over the course of CS1 to CS4 compared to Yukari during the entirety of P3 Fez. But nevertheless, Alisa apologizes anyway and makes up for it by officially confessing first if you see her true final bonding event. And so speaking of apologies, I definitely respect Junpei as well, and how he comes around and makes up with the protagonist. Okay, well like the first time, the one after Chirori's death, is kinda meh, but the second time is a real apology. You know, for blaming him for the impending end of the world after they first found out about Nyx. And not only that, but Junpei has so obviously learned his lesson once the answer comes around. Like, it's crazy how emotionally and spiritually mature Junpei is here. And even crazier that basically the most outwardly immature person at the start of the P3 journey has basically become the voice of reason for everyone when the answer rolls around. Like, I don't know how many of you know this, but Junpei is actually my favorite character in Persona. Or well, don't kill me, I haven't played Persona 2 yet. But like, even though Akechi is the most fascinating and intriguing character to me, on like a who do I respect the most as a person level, that's 100% Junpei. His story and ability to change himself is really moving to me. Especially because, just in general, as someone who has experience in a variety of social work, volunteer, internship, and job stuff over the years, I've seen a lot of clients who really want to make changes in their lives, but ultimately don't. Which is what made the people who truly change their outlook and behavior for the better over the years such incredible cases to witness. And so, lastly, this brings me to Machias, and how he's actually my favorite of all the dudes in Class 7. And yes, this is coming from someone whose favorite character in the Cold Steel arc up to CS2 was Usus. And don't get me wrong, the snarky Alberea is still one of my faves. But like, I love the consistency of Machias' growth over the course of the entire arc, including becoming less of a stick in the mud. Albeit, unfortunately, his character arc, like many in Cold Steel, is really only seen if you do all his bonding events. and even the NPC rounds in the games. But in general, compared to Usus, Machias obviously starts off as a way more flawed individual. You know, letting his prejudices get the best of him, and being an asshole to Usus and other characters, and even Reen during that funk in Chapter 2 when he finds out Reen was lying by omission about being adopted by a minor noble family. But Machias owns up to these mistakes and recognizes that he is hot-tempered and also wrong for thinking and acting the way he did, that he can't possibly lump all nobles together. And then he just straight up apologizes to Reen in Chapter 2, and even Usus in his own way. That's another thing I want to comment on. I really do think there are times when people have to be given some grace and leniency, if I can describe it that way, because I've learned that as much as some people try, it really just isn't in them to just straight up say the words, "I'm sorry." You know, like, I know this firsthand from some family members, in fact, or sometimes it even just depends on the specific person, like, someone's dealing with. So in my book, as long as the person just shows that they're genuinely trying to be better, I just chalk up the lack of some words as their individual personality. That's why I get that reading people can be hard, because not everyone says things in the same way. But yeah, in Machias and Usus's case, they've clearly made up and care about each other in the end, even if they never really outright state it. Like, various NPC rounds, like the one right after arresting the Duke in CS2, for example, shows Machias very clearly supporting Usus as a friend. And his bonding events in CS2 and CS3 clearly show a trajectory of, instead of only seeking justice for his own tribal group, the commoners, he becomes a governmental investigator to keep the ever-growing authoritarian administration in check, on behalf of all Erebonian citizens, including nobles, as well as their foreign neighbors. I'll admit, I also just really relate to Machias' interests on a personal level, since at one point I was double majoring in international relations and social work before I was diagnosed with transverse myelitis. But on a final note, his arc culminates so well with his bonding event in CS4. The aristocrat who spurred that hatred for the entire nobility in the first place is the one who Machias ends up empathizing with, forgiving, and actually keeping tabs on because he wanted to help him out in the end. And then it's so telling that in the end, Machias says it's only thanks to Reen and Usus in particular that he's come this far. So yeah, just overall, the human capacity to change is so evident in all these characters, all whom have made a lasting impression on me. But I'd love to hear about other similar characters you think fit this archetype in these two series down in the comments. And also, please join our welcoming and active community on Discord at discord.gg/LadyVirgilia, and also check out my other socials here on Twitter and on Twitch. You can support me on Patreon, which, by the way, I do want to give a huge thanks to all my patrons for their support. Thanks so much for watching, guys.